There was an alley in Frankfurt where the sun rarely managed to penetrate. It was called Judengasse, the street of the Jews, and its walls stood so close together that a man could stretch out his arms and touch both sides simultaneously. The gates that sealed that narrow corridor were locked every night, every Sunday, every Christian holiday, and during Holy Week they remained closed from dawn to dusk. There, in that strip of land compressed between stone walls and prejudice, a boy was born on February 23, 1744, whose name would echo through the corridors of power in every European capital for the next 2 centuries. Mayer Amschel Rothschild came into the world in a room so narrow that the beds had to be positioned perpendicular to the walls, as there was not enough space to align them in any other way. The house where he was born was located at the back of number 188 Judengasse, a dilapidated building known as Hinterpfand, meaning the house behind the pot, a reference to the symbol that identified the neighboring building. At that time, houses were not identified by numbers, but by symbols painted on their facades, colorful shields, stylized animals, everyday objects transformed into improvised coats of arms. Mayer Amschel's family had previously lived in a house identified by a red shield, Rothschild in German, and even after moving to Hinterpfand in 1664, they kept the name derived from that former residence, Rothschild, the Red Shield, a name that began as a simple address and would become the most recognized symbol of financial power the modern world has ever known. Mayer Amschel's father, Amschel Moses Rothschild, was a coin and money changer of modest reputation. He traveled through the fragmented principalities that made up the Holy Roman Empire, exchanging coins of different denominations, supplying rare pieces to noble collectors, and occasionally providing minor financial services to the local aristocracy. His mother, Schunk Rothschild, Eni Lechnik, maintained the household with the frugality that life in the ghetto demanded. Together, they brought 8 children into the world, of whom Mayer Amschel was one among many. Life in the Judengasse was regulated with suffocating precision. Frankfurt's Jews could only marry a limited number of times each year. No more than 12 marriages were permitted in the entire community, a measure deliberately calculated to control the population growth of that tolerated but never accepted minority. Mayer Amschel's childhood was brief. In 1755, when the boy was only 11 years old, smallpox crossed the gates of the ghetto and took his father. The following year, his mother suffered the same fate. Often before turning 13, Mayer Amschel found himself at a crossroads that would define not only his own destiny, but the destiny of future generations. His parents had planned for him a rabbinical education, preparing him for a life of religious study and contemplation. But the boy, who had lost his parents in rapid succession, instinctively understood that his survival would depend on more practical skills. With the help of relatives who recognized in him an unusual mental sharpness, Mayer Amschel secured an apprenticeship at Simon Wolf Oppenheimer's Bank in Hanover, an institution run by the grandson of the legendary financier Samuel Oppenheimer. It was in Hanover that the young Rothschild learned the fundamentals that would underpin his future empire. The currency trade was then a complex art, demanding intimate knowledge of the countless coins circulating throughout fragmented Europe, each principality with its own coinage, each kingdom with its own denominations, each city-state with its own standards of weight and metallic purity. A currency trader needed to know not only the face value of each coin, but its intrinsic value in precious metal, the conversion rates between different denominations, the risks of counterfeiting, and the seasonal fluctuations of supply and demand. Mayer Amschel absorbed this knowledge voraciously, supplementing it with studies on bills of exchange, credit instruments, and the mechanisms by which money could be moved across borders without the need to physically transport gold or silver. After 6 years of apprenticeship, in 1763, Mayer Amschel returned to Frankfurt. He was 19 years old and possessed a financial education that few in his community could match. He initially established himself in his brother's business, dedicating himself to the trade of rare coins and numismatic antiquities. It was a peculiar niche, serving aristocratic collectors whose interest in ancient coins transcended purely financial considerations. For these clients, a Roman coin or a medieval medal represented more than precious metal. It was a tangible fragment of history, an object of aesthetic contemplation and historical erudition. Mayer Amschel intuitively understood that serving this market required more than technical knowledge. It demanded the ability to establish personal relationships with men of infinitely superior social standing to his own. The masterstroke came through a connection forged during his years in Hanover. There, he met a general serving in the court of Prince William of Hesse, a passionate numismatic collector. Mayer Amschel began sending catalogues of his coins to the prince, offering rare pieces at deliberately low prices, patiently building a reputation as a reliable and honest supplier. For 4 years, he sold coins with minimal profit margins, investing in what others might consider a loss, but which he recognized as building relational capital. In 1769, this investment paid dividends when William of Hesse granted Mayer Amschel the title of Hofaktor, court agent, a designation that elevated the young merchant above the narrow confines of the ghetto and gave him access to the financial circles of the aristocracy. The following year, 1770, Mayer Amschel married Guttel Schnapper, daughter of another merchant from Judengasse. The marriage would produce 10 children who survived to adulthood, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and each of these children would play a role in expanding the family business. But it was in his 5 sons that Mayer Amschel placed his greatest hopes and his most ambitious plans. Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Karl, and Jacob, known in the family by the affectionate nicknames Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Kalman, and James, would be the 5 arrows he would shoot toward the financial capitals of Europe, each destined to establish a banking house in a different city, all united by ties of blood and commercial interest that no national border could break. While raising his children in the same narrow streets where he himself had been born, Mayer Amschel methodically expanded his business. The trade in rare coins opened doors to more substantial financial services. Prince William, who in 1785 ascended to the title of William IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, was one of the richest men in Europe, his fortune built in part through a peculiar and lucrative business, the hiring of mercenary soldiers. The Hessian regiments were renowned for their discipline and effectiveness in combat, and William rented them to foreign powers, notably the British Crown, which employed thousands of these mercenaries in its attempt to quell the American rebellion. Money flowed into the Landgrave's coffers in quantities that required sophisticated management, and Mayer Amschel skillfully positioned himself to capture an increasing share of this flow. The real leap forward came through his friendship with Carl Friedrich Buderus, the Landgrave's chief financial advisor. Mayer Amschel had presented Buderus with a particularly rare coin, a gesture of calculated generosity that established a relationship of mutual trust between the two men. Through Buderus, Rothschild gained access to increasingly substantial business, starting with small commissions and gradually moving into larger-scale operations. When the French Revolution broke out in the 1790s, transforming the political map of Europe and creating unprecedented financial demands, Mayer Amschel was positioned to seize opportunities that men of lesser vision could not even perceive. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed represented both an existential threat and a transformative opportunity for the Rothschilds. The old regime under which they had prospered was being destroyed, borders redrawn, aristocratic fortunes confiscated, and traditional financial systems dismantled. But in the chaos, there was opportunity for those who could navigate the turbulence. The movement of armies across the continent created insatiable demands for credit, foreign currency, and the transfer of funds across enemy lines. Traditional methods of government finance proved inadequate for the scale of the new wars, and private bankers with international connections became indispensable. It was in this context that Mayer Amschel made the decision that would transform a moderately successful family business into a financial powerhouse of continental reach. In 1798, he sent his 3rd son, Nathan, to England, armed with an initial capital of £20,000, a considerable sum representing his father's confidence in the exceptional abilities of that particular son. Nathan was 21 years old and had boundless ambition. He initially settled in Manchester, the centre of the burgeoning British textile industry, where cotton fabrics were revolutionizing manufacturing and creating fortunes for shrewd merchants. But Nathan quickly realized that true power lay not in the trade of goods, however lucrative, but in the trade of money itself. In 1804, Nathan became a naturalized British citizen and moved to London, where he established N.M. Rothschild and Sons in the city, the financial heart of the British Empire. The timing was impeccable. Great Britain was at war with Napoleon, a war that consumed resources on an unprecedented scale and created corresponding opportunities for those who could provide the financial services the war effort demanded. Nathan began his operations dealing in currency and gold bullion, businesses that required substantial capital, nerves of steel, and precise information about market conditions in multiple places simultaneously. He possessed all three qualities in abundance, and his firm grew with a speed that astonished more established competitors. Back in Frankfurt, Mayer Amschel watched his son's progress with a satisfaction he couldn't hide. In 1810, he formalized the family partnership through an agreement establishing M. Rothschild Judengasse, with himself and his three eldest sons still residing in Frankfurt as formal partners. Nathan, technically in enemy territory, could not legally be included in the agreement, but a promise was made that his participation would be recognized when political circumstances permitted. The 1810 partnership agreement became the foundational document of an empire that would endure for more than 2 centuries, establishing principles of family governance that prioritized unity over individual autonomy and cooperation over internal competition. The following year, 1811, the youngest son, Jacob, known as James, was sent to Paris, completing the family's strategic dispersal throughout the major financial capitals of Europe. James was only 19 when he arrived in the French capital, but he carried with him the financial education his father had provided since childhood and a network of family contacts that stretched from London to Frankfurt. His initial mission was to coordinate the purchase of coins and gold bars for his brother Nathan, but his ambitions extended far beyond these auxiliary functions. Paris was the nerve center of the Napoleonic Empire, and a presence there offered access to information and opportunities that were not available anywhere else on the continent. The great opportunity that would consolidate the Rothschild fortune arose from the logistical needs of the British Army in the Iberian Peninsula. The Duke of Wellington commanded British forces in Portugal and Spain, fighting against Napoleonic troops in a prolonged campaign that required constant supplies of money to pay soldiers, buy provisions, and bribe local authorities. The problem was that the money needed to arrive in the form of local currency, not bills of exchange or bank loans, and it needed to cross territory controlled by the enemy or allies of dubious loyalty. Traditional methods of financial transfer proved inadequate for this complex task, and the British government desperately sought someone who could solve the problem. Nathan Rothschild presented himself as the solution. Working in coordination with his brothers on the continent, he developed a system for transferring funds that represented a fundamental innovation in international finance. Gold and silver were acquired wherever they could be found, in whatever form was available: coins of dozens of different denominations, bars of precious metal, cast jewels. This metal was then transported through a network of agents, messengers, and carriers that the Rothschilds had cultivated over years, crossing borders via clandestine routes, avoiding French patrols, and finally reaching the hands of Wellington's army paymasters. Profit came not only from commissions on the transfer, but also from the currency arbitrage opportunities that each transaction presented, from fluctuations in gold prices between different markets, and from the difference between official and real exchange rates. Between 1813 and 1815, Nathan Rothschild became the principal financier of the British war effort against Napoleon. The sums involved were extraordinary. Tens of millions of pounds moved through channels that no other banker could operate with equal efficiency. The success of these operations depended on more than capital and connections. It depended on information. The Rothschilds needed to know before their competitors where gold was available, at what price, and in what quantity. They needed to anticipate troop movements that would affect transport routes. They needed to know the intentions of governments and the conditions of distant markets with a speed that normal communications did not allow. To meet this need, the Rothschilds developed a communications network that would become legendary. Their own messengers, identified by red bags that guaranteed them passage across borders even in wartime, carried mail between their houses in Frankfurt, London, Paris, and Vienna. Private boats crossed the English Channel regardless of the weather conditions that deterred ordinary merchant ships. In the 1840s, possibly earlier, the family employed carrier pigeons to transmit short, urgent messages, stationed at a farm in Hythe, on the Kent coast, which remained on the London banks books until at least 1918. The speed of Rothschild communication became proverbial, and the family deliberately cultivated the reputation for informational omniscience that this speed conferred. The Rothschilds' communication system wasn't limited to physical mechanisms for transporting messages. The brothers developed elaborate codes to protect their correspondence from prying eyes. They wrote in Judengasse, the German Hebrew dialect of the Jews of Frankfurt, using Hebrew characters that few outside their community could decipher. They added numerical codes and substitute names for people and places mentioned in their letters. A system of colored envelopes allowed messengers at post offices to quickly identify the urgent or routine nature of each piece of mail. Telegraphic codes, developed after the introduction of the telegraph in the 1850s, allowed entire sentences to be transmitted through seemingly innocent words, so that a message about the weather in Alexandria could actually communicate instructions on buying government bonds. In September of 1812, as Wellington's campaign in the Iberian Peninsula approached a critical point, Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in Frankfurt. He was 68 years old and had transformed a small exchange business into a financial operation of continental reach. His will established principles that would guide the family for generations. The business should remain under the exclusive control of direct male descendants. No public inventory of the family estate should be permitted. Disputes should be resolved internally without recourse to external courts. And above all, the brothers should maintain unity of purpose even when separated by national borders. These principles would be tested repeatedly in the following decades, but the fundamental structure that Mayer Amschel established would remain intact for more than a century after his death. The eldest son, Amschel, assumed nominal leadership of the Frankfurt business, but the real power had migrated to London, where Nathan had built an operation that eclipsed all the other family houses combined. The Rothschild fortune, already substantial when Mayer Amschel died, was about to multiply exponentially through events that would transform the balance of power in Europe. June 1815 brought the battle that would become synonymous with the end of an era. On a muddy field near the Belgian village of Waterloo, the armies of Wellington and Blücher clashed with Napoleon's forces in a battle that would decide the fate of the continent. And in London, Nathan Rothschild awaited news with an anxiety that transcended the academic interest of a distant observer. The legend that crystallized around Nathan Rothschild and the Battle of Waterloo has become one of the most repeated and distorted stories in financial history. In the version popularized by later writers, many of them motivated by thinly veiled anti-Semitism, Nathan supposedly received news of Wellington's victory via his carrier pigeons 24 hours before the information reached the British government. He then allegedly went to the stock exchange and ostensibly began selling government bonds, leading other traders to believe that Wellington had been defeated. When panic set in and prices plummeted, Nathan supposedly secretly bought massive volumes of bonds at liquidation prices. When the real news arrived and prices soared, he allegedly pocketed profits that some estimated millions of pounds. The reality, as is often the case, was more complex and less cinematic than the legend. The Rothschild archives confirmed that the family did indeed possess a communication network faster than official channels, and that Nathan likely received news of the victory before the British government. A letter from a Rothschild employee, John Roworth, later sent from Paris, mentioned in passing that Nathan had done well with the advance information about Waterloo. But detailed analyses of the Rothschild finances, conducted by historian Niall Ferguson with access to the family archives, suggest that the fortune was not made through one-day stock market speculation. In fact, the family had bet on a prolonged war, and Wellington's decisive victory represented a disruption to their business plans that offset any short-term gains from bonds. The real profit from Waterloo came not from a single speculative transaction, but from the central role the Rothschilds played in financing the war effort and the subsequent financial reconstruction. Between 1814 and 1815, Nathan provided the British government with approximately £9.8 million in subsidies for continental allies, a sum that represented a substantial fraction of the total cost of the war. The commissions, favourable exchange rates, and arbitrage opportunities generated by these transactions multiplied the family's capital in proportions that no single day's operation could match. When the peace treaties were signed and Europe began the long process of reconstruction, the Rothschilds emerged as the most powerful bankers on the continent. The years immediately following Waterloo witnessed the consolidation of the Rothschild Empire in its classic form. In 1820, Salomon settled permanently in Vienna, founding S.M. von Rothschild to serve the Austrian Empire. Prince Metternich, architect of the conservative European order that emerged from the Congress of Vienna, became a client and protector of the Viennese house. In 1821, Karl moved to Naples, where he founded C.M.D. Rothschild Figli to serve the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. James formalized his Parisian operation as the Rothschild father race, with his brothers as nominal partners. Frankfurt remained under Amschel's direction, although its relative importance diminished as the other houses grew. In 1822, Emperor Francis I of Austria granted the 5 brothers the hereditary title of Baron, Friar in Austrian terminology. A coat of arms was created for the family, incorporating elements that would become iconic. The red shield that gave the family its name, and a clenched fist holding 5 arrows, symbolizing the 5 brothers and the strength derived from their union. The adopted motto, Concordia, Integritas, Industria Harmony, Integrity, Diligence, articulated the values that the family proclaimed as the foundation of its success. The brothers who lived in German-speaking territories began to use the prefix von before the surname, while James in Paris adopted the French Fondé, and Nathan in London, with his characteristic pragmatism, refused foreign titles, declaring that simply Mr. Rothschild was good enough for him. The architecture of the Rothschild Empire at its peak represented a fundamental innovation in the organization of international business. 5 legally independent houses, each operating under the laws of its country of residence, were united by blood ties, partnership agreements, and mutual commercial interest. Information flowed constantly between the houses through the communications network the family had built, allowing each brother to learn about market conditions in the other locations with a speed that no competitor could match. When an opportunity arose in Vienna, Paris could provide capital. When a risk materialized in Naples, London could absorb losses. This geographical diversification conferred a resilience that no single house, however large, could replicate. The Rothschilds' business in the 1820s and subsequent decades centered on what we would now call investment banking, although the term did not yet exist. Governments needed money to finance current operations, pay off old debts, build infrastructure, or wage war. Traditional methods of raising capital, through taxes or short-term loans from local bankers, often proved inadequate for the growing needs of the modern state. The Rothschilds offered an alternative, issuing government bonds that would be sold to investors in multiple markets simultaneously, with the family guaranteeing the placement and assuming the risk of potential sales failures. In exchange for this guarantee, they received substantial commissions and frequently obtained the bonds at prices below face value, profiting from the difference when they sold them to the public. The first major success of this model came with loans to post-Napoleonic France. The peace treaty that ended the Napoleonic Wars imposed a heavy indemnity on France to be paid to the victorious powers. The government of Louis XVIII needed capital to pay this indemnity without destroying the domestic economy, and the Rothschilds offered the means to obtain this capital. James in Paris coordinated local operations, while his brothers in other locations ensured the placement of French bonds with foreign investors. The success of this operation established a pattern that would be repeated countless times in the following decades, with governments of Prussia, Austria, Naples, Brazil, and dozens of other countries turning to the Rothschilds when they needed capital in volumes that local markets could not supply. The July Revolution of 1830, which overthrew the restored Bourbons and placed Louis Philippe on the French throne, illustrated both the power and the vulnerability of the Rothschild position. Initial political instability threatened the family's investments in bonds of the deposed government, but James Rothschild moved with characteristic speed, assembling the loan package that stabilized the new government's finances and establishing personal relationships with the new regime that proved as lucrative as previous ones. In recognition of his services, Louis Philippe elevated James to Grand Officer of the Legion of Honor, a distinction rarely granted to bankers and even more rarely to Jews. The lesson was clear. The Rothschilds served states, not particular regimes, and their usefulness transcended the political preferences of any specific government. The 1830s also marked the beginning of the Rothschilds' involvement with what would become the largest infrastructure undertaking of the 19th century, the railroads. The railway revolution had begun in England, where pioneering lines demonstrated the transformative potential of rail transport. But railway construction required capital on a scale that few individual investors could provide. The costs of acquiring land, building trackbeds, bridges and tunnels, purchasing locomotives and wagons, represented investments of millions of pounds that needed to be mobilized before a single passenger or ton of cargo could be transported. The Rothschilds recognized both the opportunity and the risk, and positioned themselves to capture a substantial share of European railway financing. In Vienna, Salomon obtained a concession in 1832 to build the first steam railway in the Austrian Empire, linking Vienna to the coal mining region of Bohemia. The Kaiser Ferdinand's Nordbahn, as it was called, would take 26 years to complete, a period during which Salomon and his heirs would invest colossal sums in construction, face seemingly insurmountable technical obstacles, and transform the economic landscape of Central Europe. Railway investment naturally led to investment in related industries. In 1842, Salomon acquired the Witkowice steelworks in what is now the Czech Republic, an operation that supplied the steel necessary for railway expansion and which would remain in Rothschild hands for almost a century. In France, James followed a parallel path. The Northern Railway Company, concessionaire of the lines that would connect Paris to the English Channel and the Belgian border, became a central investment of the Parisian house. James recognized that control of the railways conferred power that transcended the direct profits of transportation. The railway lines determined which cities would prosper and which would stagnate, which industries would find markets and which would wither for lack of access. Railway investment positioned the Rothschilds at the center of the industrialization process that was transforming Europe, giving them political influence that complemented their financial power. Rivalry with other bankers added a competitive dimension to these investments. The Pariah brothers, French bankers of Portuguese origin who had converted to Christianity, challenged Rothschild's supremacy in railway financing and raising capital for industrial projects. Their CRD Mobiliar, an innovative investment bank, raised funds from the general public and directed them towards industrial ventures, democratizing in a way a process that the Rothschilds kept under strict family control. The competition between the Rothschilds and Pariahs became one of the great financial narratives of the Second French Empire, with the two groups vying for concessions, clients, and political influence. When CRD Mobiliar collapsed in 1867, a victim of excessively rapid expansion and poor management, the Rothschilds emerged as the undisputed winners of this dispute. But the victory over the Pariahs did not eliminate deeper threats to the Rothschild business model. The second half of the 19th century witnessed the emergence of publicly traded banks, institutions that raised capital from thousands of shareholders and could mobilize sums that no family, however wealthy, could match. In England, Midland Bank, Lloyds, and other commercial banks expanded rapidly, offering financial services to a much wider clientele than the aristocracy and governments that constituted the traditional Rothschild customer base. In Germany, Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank emerged as financial powerhouses whose combined capital surpassed that of the Rothschilds. The family banking model, which had conferred decisive advantages in the era of slow communications and personal trust, was becoming progressively obsolete in the era of the telegraph and joint stock companies. The Rothschilds adapted to these transformations with varying degrees of success. The Viennese house, under the leadership of Anselm, son of Salomon, founded Creditanstalt in 1855, a publicly traded bank modelled on CRD Mobiliar, but firmly controlled by the Rothschilds through a 40% shareholding. Creditanstalt quickly became the largest bank in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, financing the industrialization of Central Europe and accumulating stakes in companies across all sectors of the economy. But the creation of a publicly traded bank also represented a dilution of the family model, a concession to the need for capital that the family alone could not provide. In London, Nathan Mayer Rothschild died in July 1836 at the age of 58, a victim of an abscess that the medicine of the time could not treat. His death was announced in England by a carrier pigeon that arrived from Frankfurt, an ironic detail that underscored the importance of the communication systems he had helped to build. Leadership of the London Bank passed to his eldest son, Lionel, who had been groomed since childhood to take command. Lionel proved to possess his father's qualities, expanding the bank's business while navigating the political and economic transformations of the mid-century. Lionel Rothschild's most lasting legacy may not have been financial, but political. In 1847, he was elected a Member of Parliament for the City of London constituency, a victory that should have been the crowning achievement of his public career. But British law required every Member of Parliament to take an oath that included words about the true Christian faith, words a practicing Jew could not honestly pronounce. Lionel repeatedly appeared before Parliament, was repeatedly prevented from taking office, and repeatedly re-elected by constituents who insisted on their right to be represented by the man of their choice. The battle for Lionel's right to occupy his seat in Parliament became a broader symbol of the struggle for Jewish emancipation in Great Britain. For 11 years, the stalemate persisted. The House of Commons, where public opinion favoured reform, repeatedly passed bills allowing Jews to hold public office without renouncing their faith. The House of Lords, dominated by conservatives and Anglican clergy, repeatedly rejected these bills. Lionel resigned his seat and ran again in special elections, repeatedly demonstrating that the electorate supported him despite the legal obstacles he faced. Finally, in 1858, a compromise was reached. Each chamber of parliament could determine the form of oath required of its members. On July 26th of that year, Lionel de Rothschild took the oath with his head covered, replacing the offensive words with "So help me Jehovah," and took his seat as the first Jewish member of the British Parliament. Lionel's victory represented more than a personal or family achievement. It symbolized the growing integration of Jews into European society, at least in Western Europe. But this integration remained incomplete and vulnerable. When Prime Minister Gladstone proposed to Queen Victoria that Lionel be elevated to the peerage, making him the first Jew in the House of Lords, the Queen refused. Elevating a Jew to the nobility, she argued, would arouse antagonism, and it would be inappropriate to reward a man whose vast fortune derived from what she called a kind of gambling. Only in 1885, after Lionel's death, did the Queen agree to elevate her son Nathan to the peerage, creating him the first Baron Rothschild. While Lionel fought for the right to sit in Parliament, the London bank's business continued to expand. Government financing remained central to the house's operations, with loans to countries on every continent. Brazil, newly independent from Portugal, became a Rothschild client in the 1820s, establishing a relationship that would last for generations. Smaller European nations, from Belgium to Greece, turned to the Rothschilds when they needed capital to build railroads, establish monetary systems, or pay debts. The family had become, in the words of a contemporary, the brokers and advisors to the kings of Europe and the Republican leaders of America. The most dramatic episode of the Rothschilds' involvement with government finances occurred in November 1875. The Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, was in severe financial difficulties, the result of extravagant spending and reckless borrowing. To obtain immediate cash, he offered for sale his stake in the Suez Canal Company, the waterway that had revolutionized world trade since its opening in 1869. France, which already controlled the majority of the company's shares, was positioned to acquire the Egyptian shares and consolidate its dominance over the most important route between Europe and Asia. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli immediately understood the strategic implications. Britain depended on the Suez Canal for its communications with India, the jewel of its empire. Allowing France complete control of the canal would represent an unacceptable vulnerability. But Parliament was not in session, and there was no constitutional way to approve a £4 million expenditure without parliamentary debate. Disraeli turned to his old friend Lionel de Rothschild. Legend has it that the meeting was brief. Disraeli explained what he needed. Lionel asked what guarantee the government offered. Disraeli replied that the guarantee was the British government, and Lionel agreed to provide the funds. If any document was signed at that meeting, it has not survived in the archives. Within 5 months, the loan was fully repaid, but the political consequences lasted for decades. The British government's purchase of Suez Canal shares, financed by the Rothschilds without parliamentary authorization, became a symbol of both Disraeli's audacity and the power of private bankers to shape imperial politics. Political opponents accused the Prime Minister of subverting the constitutional system by carrying out a transaction of such magnitude without consulting Parliament. Defenders argued that the opportunity demanded immediate action and that the result justified the means. What no one could deny was that a Jewish banker in London had provided, practically by his own personal decision, the means for Britain to acquire a strategic asset of incalculable importance. The final years of the 19th century witnessed both the continued expansion and the first signs of decline of the Rothschild Empire. In France, James died in 1868, and leadership passed to his sons Alphonse, Gustave, and Edmund, who continued to expand the Parisian house's business. The bank's capital, which totaled £55,000 when James founded it in 1815, had grown to over £16 million by 1878, 10 years after his death. Investments had diversified beyond government bonds and railroads, encompassing copper mines in Spain's Rio Tinto, oil exploration in Russian Azerbaijan, and the celebrated Bordeaux vineyards that still bear the Rothschild name today. The Naples branch was the first to cease operations. The unification of Italy in 1861 radically transformed the political environment in which Karl and his successors had operated. The Neapolitan aristocracy that constituted their client base lost power and influence under the new Piedmontese regime. When Adolf, Karl's son, refused to financially support the deposed King Francis II and encountered resistance from his cousins in the other branches, the family tension combined with commercial difficulties made continued operation unsustainable. In 1863, after 42 years of operation, the Neapolitan branch closed its doors. The Frankfurt branch suffered a similar fate, although for different reasons. Amschel, the eldest son of Mayor Amschel, never married and had no children. When he died in 1855, leadership of the branch passed to Wilhelm, son of Karl of Naples, who had moved to Frankfurt after the closure of the Neapolitan branch. But Wilhelm also died without male heirs in 1901, and with his death ended the Rothschild banking presence in the city where it had all begun. It would take almost a century, until 1989, for the Rothschilds to return to Frankfurt, this time as representatives of the London and Zurich branches. The 20th century began with the Rothschilds still among the world's wealthiest families, but their relative position had deteriorated significantly. The new financial giants, the publicly traded banks with their branch networks and thousands of employees, could mobilize resources that no single private family could match. The introduction of national tax systems, with income taxes and inheritance taxes, complicated the Rothschilds' traditional strategy of operating as a single transnational entity with unified accounting records. Each national house came to be treated as a separate entity for tax purposes, eroding the advantages that the family structure conferred. World War I represented an even deeper rupture. The Rothschilds had prospered during the Napoleonic Wars, precisely because they operated on both sides of the conflict, moving funds across battle lines and profiting from the universal need for financial services. But the war that began in 1914 was different. Cousins who had grown up together, educated in the same schools, frequented the same salons, now found themselves on opposite sides of a front line tearing the continent apart. Correspondence between the houses, which had flowed uninterrupted for over a century, was cut off by the demands of war. The communication systems that had conferred competitive advantages became suspect in the eyes of governments paranoid about espionage. The letters that survived in the family archives reveal the anxiety and bewilderment of those years. In August of 1914, when banks across Europe closed their doors and stock exchanges suspended operations, the Rothschilds of London wrote to their Parisian cousins expressing hope that lines of communication could be maintained despite the conflict. But the hope was in vain. For 4 years, the cousins remained separated, each household serving the war effort of its respective country, unable to coordinate operations that had been the essence of the family business model. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918 had particularly severe consequences for the Viennese bank. Creditanstalt, which had grown to become the empire's largest bank, suddenly found itself operating in an Austria reduced to a fraction of its former territory. Many of the bank's industrial assets were located in territories that now belonged to Czechoslovakia, Poland, or other successor nations, greatly complicating the institution's management. The economic turmoil of the 1920s, with hyperinflation followed by deflation, further eroded the bank's position. In May 1931, Creditanstalt declared itself unable to publish its financial statements for the previous year, triggering panic that reverberated throughout the European financial system. The collapse of Creditanstalt is often cited as one of the events that precipitated the Great Depression in Europe, transforming an American crisis into a global catastrophe. The Austrian government organized a bailout that distributed the costs between the national treasury, the central bank, and the Rothschild family. But the institution never fully recovered its former position. Baron Louis de Rothschild, who headed the Viennese firm, saw his fortune and reputation devastated by a collapse he did not cause but could not prevent. The rise of Nazism added an existential dimension to financial hardship. The Rothschilds, as the most visible Jewish family in Europe, became prime targets of anti-Semitic propaganda. The Nazi film Die Rothschilds Act in AUF Waterloo, released in 1940, portrayed the family as a parasitic conspiracy manipulating governments and armies for their own profit, repackaging old anti-Semitic tropes with the veneer of modern filmmaking. The grotesque caricature of Nathan Rothschild presented in the film represented not only an attack on a specific family, but the crystallization of centuries of prejudice in images that would pave the way for far greater atrocities. When Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, Baron Louis was immediately arrested. His crimes, in the eyes of the Nazis, included the losses the Austrian state had suffered in the bailout of the Kreditanstalt 7 years earlier. For over a year, Louis remained in custody while his family negotiated his release. The final price, $21 million, was described as the largest bail ever paid for an individual in history. Even after payment, Louis was only allowed to leave the country in March 1939, emigrating to the United States, where he would live out the rest of his days in exile from the land where his family had prospered for over a century. The assets of the Austrian Rothschilds were confiscated under the euphemism of compulsory administration. The artwork accumulated over generations was emptied from the family mansions and distributed among state museums. The stake in Kreditanstalt was transferred to German hands, with Deutsche Bank assuming effective control of the institution. It would take more than half a century, until 1999, for some of these assets to be returned to the surviving heirs, and even then the restitution was partial and contested. In France, the German occupation brought similarly devastating consequences. The French Rothschilds fled when the Wehrmacht advanced on Paris in June 1940, leaving behind properties and assets that would be promptly confiscated by the Vichy regime and its German occupying authorities. The Château de Ferry race, the magnificent country residence that James had built in the previous century, was occupied by German officers. The art collections were looted, the vineyards placed under the administration of collaborators. Only with the liberation of 1944 could the Rothschilds return to Paris and begin the long process of reconstruction. The post-war period brought a partial restoration of family fortunes. In England, N.M. Rothschild and Sons had survived the war relatively unscathed, their position protected by Britain's insular geography. The London House resumed its role as advisor to governments and financier of infrastructure projects, adapting to the new realities of the bipolar world emerging from the ashes of war. In France, Guy de Rothschild undertook the reconstruction of the Parisian house, recovering confiscated properties and re-establishing commercial relations interrupted by the occupation. But the world that emerged from the Second World War was fundamentally different from the one in which the Rothschilds had prospered. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, created a new framework for international finance in which central banks and multilateral institutions played roles previously held by private bankers. The process of decolonization reduced the importance of imperial financing, which had been a mainstay of Rothschild business. The emergence of the welfare state, with its public pension and social security systems, channeled savings that had previously found their way into investments mediated by private banks. The family adapted to these transformations by diversifying into new sectors and consolidating operations in areas where they maintained competitive advantages. The mergers and acquisitions consulting business, which required long-term relationships and an impeccable reputation more than massive capital, became a growing focus of operations in both London and Paris. The Bordeaux vineyards, transformed from a financial investment into an emblem of prestige and tradition, gained importance that transcended their direct economic value. Philanthropy, always present in the family's activities, assumed greater public prominence, with donations to museums, universities, and humanitarian causes projecting a more palatable image to the democratic sensibilities of the post-war period. The most severe blow of the post-war period came not from the markets or competitors, but from the state. In 1981, the socialist government of François Mitterrand nationalized 39 French banks, including Bank Rothschild. The decision was part of a broader program of nationalizations reflecting the political project of the French left, but for the Rothschilds it represented an expropriation that evoked memories of previous persecutions. Guy de Rothschild, who had dedicated his life to rebuilding the Parisian house, published a bitter letter to newspapers declaring that being Jewish in Mitterrand's France had once again become a cause for fear and persecution. The accusation of anti-Semitism against Mitterrand was controversial and probably exaggerated, but the underlying pain was real. For almost 2 centuries, the Rothschilds had built their presence in France, financing governments of all political stripes, employing thousands of workers, contributing to cultural institutions and humanitarian causes. And now, with a bureaucratic stroke of the pen, their company was confiscated and renamed Compagnie Europe NED Bank. the Rothschild name deliberately erased from the institution the family had founded. But the Rothschilds' history repeatedly demonstrated that the family possessed a capacity for recovery that transcended the circumstances of any individual generation. David de Rothschild, then 39 years old, refused to accept nationalization as the final outcome. Using Paris All ANS, a company originally founded in 1838 as a railway company and later transformed into a holding company for diverse holdings, David began the reconstruction. With initial capital of just $1 million and 3 employees, he and his cousins Eric and Nathaniel began to rebuild a bank that would eventually rival the nationalized institution in importance. The ban on using the Rothschild name lasted until 1986, when the company was renamed Rothschild ACI Bank. In the following decades, through strategic acquisitions, geographic expansion, and meticulous cultivation of relationships with institutional clients, the new entity grew to become one of Europe's leading financial consultancies. In 2003, under David's leadership, the London and Paris offices were finally reunified under a common corporate structure, achieving an integration that had been impossible while the businesses remained separate legal entities. The reunification represented, in a way, a return to the original model that Mayer Amschel had conceived 2 centuries earlier, with a single family controlling coordinated operations in multiple countries. The story that began in a narrow alley in Frankfurt in 1744 had traversed world wars, revolutions, nationalizations, and technological transformations that would have been unimaginable to Mayer Amschel and his contemporaries. The carrier pigeon had given way to the telegraph, which had given way to the telephone, which had given way to instant electronic communication that allowed transactions of billions of dollars to be executed in milliseconds. The fragmented principalities of the Holy Roman Empire had consolidated into modern nation-states, then fragmented again in devastating wars, to finally converge into a European Union that eliminated the borders across which the early Rothschilds had built their fortune transporting gold and information. Through all these transformations, something of the original essence had survived. The Rothschilds of the 21st century were not the world's richest bankers, a position long since ceded to families whose fortunes derived from oil, technology, or industrial-scale manufacturing. But they maintained a presence in the world of finance that transcended the simple metrics of balance sheet size or market capitalization. The Rothschild name still carried a resonance that few other financial brands could match, a combination of history, prestige, and expertise that clients paid a premium to access. 21st century businesses focused on mergers and acquisitions consulting, wealth management for high-net-worth families, and alternative investments through private equity funds. These were businesses that demanded long-term relationships, experienced judgment, and the patience that came from operating on horizons that transcended the quarterly earning cycles that dominated the metrics of publicly traded banks. The partnership structure, which the family had maintained even as capital pressure pushed competitors toward initial public offerings, conferred advantages in sectors where continuity of relationships and the ability to think in decades rather than quarters made a competitive difference. The vineyards of Bordeaux remain tangible testament to the Rothschild presence in the European landscape. Stollorfite, acquired by James in 1868, and Stowe-Mouton, acquired by his nephew Nathaniel 15 years earlier, produced some of the most prestigious and expensive wines in the world. These were properties that generated modest profits compared to financial operations, but whose value lay primarily in the prestige they conferred and the connections they allowed to cultivate. A dinner paired with fine Rothschild wines created networking opportunities that no PowerPoint presentation could replicate. Philanthropy, always present in the family's history, had become more visible and structured in recent decades. Foundations in the names of various family members supported causes ranging from environmental conservation to Jewish education, from medical research to the preservation of historical heritage. Waddesdon Manor in England, built by Ferdinand de Rothschild in the 19th century and donated to the National Trust in 1957, received hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, offering a glimpse into the high Victorian lifestyle that the Rothschild fortune had afforded. In Israel, the Yad Hanedif Foundation, established by the French branch of the family, had financed the construction of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the new National Library. But even as the 21st century progressed, shadows of the past persisted in unexpected forms. The conspiracy theories that had haunted the Rothschilds since the 19th century found new life in the age of social media, amplified by algorithms that rewarded provocative content regardless of its veracity. The same tropes that had appeared in 19th century anti-Semitic pamphlets and Nazi propaganda films resurfaced in internet memes and YouTube videos, often without their propagators acknowledging the historical roots of the material they circulated. The family that had successfully navigated revolutions, world wars, and nationalizations now found itself confronting an informational environment in which truth and fiction blurred with disconcerting fluidity. The family's responses to this environment were typically discreet. The Rothschilds had survived for 2 centuries in part by maintaining a low public profile, avoiding ostentation that would attract adverse attention, preferring influence exerted through discreet channels to visible power that would invite opposition. This strategy had served well in earlier times, but it adapted imperfectly to an era in which silence was often interpreted as confirmation of suspicions, and in which the absence of a response created a vacuum that others were quick to fill with speculation. The family structure, which had been a source of strength for centuries, also presented challenges in the contemporary context. Mayer Amschel's principle that control should remain exclusively in the hands of direct male descendants had become progressively unsustainable in an era that rejected gender-based discrimination. Women in the family, excluded from leadership positions for generations, had demonstrated administrative and entrepreneurial capabilities that rivaled those of their male relatives. Adapting to more egalitarian norms required a revision of traditions that had served well in previous contexts, but were losing legitimacy in the contemporary world. The issue of inheritance and succession, always delicate in business families, acquired additional complexity when the company in question operated in multiple countries and when the potential heirs numbered in the dozens. The partnership agreements that governed the various Rothschild entities established mechanisms for the transfer of shares between generations, but the execution of these mechanisms required continuous negotiation between family branches whose interests did not always align perfectly. The unity that Mayer Amschel had prescribed as the foundation of family success remained an ideal to be pursued, not an automatic reality guaranteed by blood-tear eyes. The building at No. 2 St. Swithin's Lane, in the city of London, where N.M. Rothschild and Sons had operated since 1809, represented both the continuity and the transformation of the Rothschild presence in global finance. The address was the same one Nathan had chosen more than 2 centuries earlier, but the building had been rebuilt multiple times, adapting to the needs of successive eras. The room where the price of gold had been fixed twice a day for almost a century, a tradition that only ended in 2004, had witnessed generations of traders sitting in chairs bearing the family name. Now transformed into an open workspace with computer terminals and real-time data screens, the room retained echoes of an era when crucial decisions were made by men who knew each other personally and sealed deals with handshakes. At the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the combined fortune of the various branches of the Rothschild family was estimated at figures that varied widely depending on which assets were included and how they were valued. The most conservative estimates placed the total at a few $billion, modest compared to the largest contemporary fortunes, but still representing substantial wealth. More generous estimates, which included stakes in private companies, real estate holdings, and art collections whose market value was difficult to determine, reached much higher figures. The truth was that no one outside the family, and possibly not everyone within it, knew precisely the extent of the family resources accumulated over more than 2 centuries of financial activity. What remained indisputable was the influence the family had exerted on the development of the global financial system. The Rothschilds hadn't invented international banking, but they had demonstrated how to operate it on a scale that predecessors couldn't have imagined. They hadn't invented government debt securities, but they had created international markets for these securities that allowed states to mobilize resources from investors in multiple countries simultaneously. They hadn't invented railroads, but they had financed networks that transformed the economic geography of continents. They hadn't invented high-speed communications, but they had demonstrated how informational advantage could be converted into competitive advantage in financial markets. This influence came with a responsibility that the family had not always been able or willing to exercise. Loans to authoritarian governments had allowed those governments to resist pressure for reform for longer. The financing of railroads had accelerated industrialization, transforming landscapes and communities in ways that were not always beneficial to those affected. The refusal to finance certain ventures, such as participation in the opium trade or speculation in certain types of commodities, demonstrated that the family recognized ethical limits to its business dealings, but these limits were defined by the standards of their respective era's standards that later perspectives often deemed inadequate. The question of how to assess the Rothschild legacy did not allow for simple answers. For some, the family represented the best of entrepreneurship, demonstrating how talent, discipline, and family cooperation could overcome discrimination and create wealth that benefited not only its creators but entire societies through employment, investment, and philanthropy. For others, the Rothschilds symbolized the excesses of financial capitalism, a transnational elite whose primary loyalty was to itself and whose power transcended the democratic controls that should govern the societies in which they operated. The truth likely lay somewhere between these extremes, too complex to fit into simple narratives of heroism or villainy. What the Rothschild story unequivocally demonstrated was the precariousness of all fortunes, however colossal they may have seemed at their peak. The family that had been the richest in the world in the 19th century had seen its relative position continually erode throughout the 20th century, not through a single catastrophic disaster, but through 1,000 small transformations that gradually altered the competitive landscape in which they operated. Publicly traded banks with massive resources, changes in the tax structure that eliminated the advantages of transnational operations, technological revolutions that democratized access to information that was previously the privilege of a few, world wars that destroyed fortunes accumulated over generations. Each of these forces contributed to a relative decline that no specific strategy could completely reverse. In this gradual erosion, there was something that seemed inevitable, almost natural. Empires built by individuals of exceptional genius rarely survived intact for many generations. The energy and vision that characterized the founders were hardly transmitted in their entirety to heirs who had not known the necessity that forges ambition or faced the adversities that develop resilience. The partnership agreements that Mayer Amschel had designed to maintain family unity worked well as long as the alternative was fragmentation, which would weaken everyone involved. But they became inconvenient restrictions when individual heirs glimpsed opportunities that the collective structure did not allow them to pursue. Nevertheless, the Rothschilds had lasted longer and better than most comparable business dynasties. Families that had amassed similar fortunes in the 19th century often saw their wealth dissipated within a few generations through extravagant spending, succession disputes, or simply an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Rothschilds, in contrast, maintained a significant presence in multiple sectors of the economy more than 2 centuries after Mayer Amschel established his small exchange business on Frankfurt's Judengasse. This longevity was no accident. It reflected values passed down through generations, institutional structures that outlived any individual member, and a culture that balanced ambition with prudence. The house on Judengasse, where it had all begun, no longer existed. Destroyed in an American bombing raid in May 1944, it had joined the many other structures that the 20th century reduced to rubble. Where once stood the narrow walls of the ghetto, where gates locked Frankfurt's Jews in nightly confinement, now stretched a modern avenue bearing no visible trace of the past. Commemorative plaques and a small museum reminded occasional visitors of the history those streets had witnessed, but most who passed by did so unaware of the transformations that had shaped that space over the centuries. Mayer Amschel was buried in Frankfurt's old Jewish cemetery, next to the Judengasse where he was born and lived his entire life. The tombstone, in Hebrew, recorded dates and family relationships without mentioning the worldly achievements that had made his name synonymous with wealth and power. Was this an intentional omission, reflecting religious values that placed piety above material accumulation, or simply the convention of an era that reserved laudatory epitaphs for Gentiles, while Jewish graves maintained a more austere decorum? The questions remained unanswered, like so many others about a man whose life, documented in family archives, still concealed mysteries that later generations of historians could not fully penetrate. What the documents revealed was enough to outline an extraordinary life lived in extraordinary circumstances. An orphaned boy in a medieval ghetto who became the most powerful banker of his era. A father who educated his children not only in accounting and currency exchange, but in values of family loyalty and cooperation that would sustain an enterprise for centuries after his death. a man of faith who navigated the courts of the Christian aristocracy without abandoning the religious practices that set him apart in a society that tolerated Jews only insofar as they were useful. A visionary who recognized opportunities in the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars that less perceptive observers failed to see. And beyond the documents, beyond the tombstones and commemorative plaques, remained the tangible reality of a financial network that stretched across continents, employing thousands of people, moving billions of dollars, advising governments and corporations on decisions that affected millions of lives. There remained the vineyards whose wines were served at tables where world business was discussed. There remained the art collections in public museums, donated by family members who had amassed treasures using the same methods they had accumulated capital. There remained the philanthropic institutions that distributed resources to causes that donors deemed worthy of support. Above all, the question that had haunted the Rothschilds since Mayer Amschel made his first sale of rare coins to a collector prince remained: what was the purpose of all this wealth? For Mayer Amschel, the answer was perhaps simply survival. The security derived from sufficient resources to protect family and community against the uncertainties of a hostile world. For later generations, the answer became more complex as basic needs were met and further accumulation required justifications that transcended material utility. Some family members responded through philanthropy, converting wealth into institutions that would serve public purposes for generations. Others responded through collecting, surrounding themselves with beautiful objects whose contemplation offered pleasures that money in abstract form could not provide. Still, others responded through the perpetual expansion of the family enterprise, finding meaning in the building process even when the material results exceeded any conceivable need. And some, perhaps, simply did not respond, living in wealth as they had inherited it, without questioning premises that had been established before their birth. The Rothschild story did not offer a definitive answer to that perennial question about the purpose of wealth. What it did offer was an extended illustration of the possibilities and limitations that fortune presents, a demonstration across multiple generations of how material resources can be employed for diverse purposes, and how even the most vast resources cannot guarantee specific results or protect against all the contingencies that history presents. It was a story that resisted simple morals precisely because it was too complex to fit into any reductionist formula. Years passed, generations followed, and the Rothschild name remained in the financial directories of London and Paris, on wine bottle labels in collectors' cellars, on the plaques of historic buildings that the family had built or acquired over the centuries. It was a name that evoked distinct responses in different audiences: admiration in some, suspicion in others, curiosity in many. It was a name that had survived transformations that would have destroyed less resilient presences, continually adapting without completely losing its connection to its origins. It was, perhaps above all, a name that reminded the world of the human capacity to overcome adverse circumstances through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and a bit of that unpredictable fortune that the ancients called destiny. There was something melancholic about this persistence, a shadow of loss that accompanied the celebration of continuity. The world that had allowed the first Rothschilds to build their fortune no longer existed. The principalities where Mayer Amschel had begun his career had dissolved into nation-states that in turn had confederated into supranational unions. The methods of communication that conferred a competitive advantage had been democratized and superseded by technologies that made information instantly available to anyone with an internet connection. The financial markets where Nathan had operated, with their physical exchanges where brokers shouted orders to each other, had given way to electronic networks where algorithms executed millions of transactions per second. In each of these transformations, something was lost along with something that was gained. The speed of modern communication had eliminated the opportunities for informational arbitrage that had been an important source of Rothschild profits. The democratization of access to financial services had reduced dependence on sophisticated intermediaries that only Rothschild families with resources and connections could provide. Globalization had created competitors in parts of the world where previously no comparable financial structures existed. Regulation had multiplied restrictions on practices that previous generations had freely employed. The Rothschilds had adapted to each of these changes, finding niches where their particular skills still offered value, withdrawing from sectors where they could no longer compete effectively. Evolution was natural for any enterprise that survived for more than 2 centuries, but each adaptation also represented a partial renunciation of what had been. The banking empire of the mid-19th century, when the five brothers dominated European finance, was irrecoverable not because anyone had failed, but because the conditions that had made it possible simply no longer existed. And so the story continued, without a definitive conclusion, without a final moral to tie all the threads together in a satisfactory synthesis. The Rothschilds of 2025 were not the Rothschilds of 1825, just as these had not been the Rothschilds of 1725. The family had transformed itself over generations, maintaining some elements of continuity while discarding others, adapting to perpetually changing circumstances while preserving an identity that transcended any individual member. It was, in many ways, the story of any family spanning centuries, magnified by the scale of the resources involved and the public visibility that wealth conferred, but fundamentally human in its dynamics of cooperation and conflict, continuity and transformation. The red shield that gave the family its name still adorned corporate documents, letterheads, and business cards of executives who managed the businesses founded by ancestors they knew only through portraits and archival records. It was a symbol that carried the weight of all that history, a mark that simultaneously represented accumulated tradition and a promise of future continuity. Whether the next centuries would bring the family prosperity comparable to the previous ones or a gradual eclipse amidst still unimaginable transformations, no one could predict with certainty. What could be said with confidence was that the Rothschild story would continue to be told, studied, and debated as long as there was interest in understanding how individuals and families navigate the currents of history, seizing opportunities presented by their circumstances, building institutions that outlive any individual lifetime, and leaving marks on the world that endure far beyond their own years. The narrative that unfolded through the Rothschild generations was also the narrative of financial modernity itself, with all its ambivalencies and contradictions. The mechanisms the family had perfected for moving capital across borders became the foundations upon which the global financial system of the 20th and 21st centuries would be built. The innovations Nathan had introduced in war financing, the ability to pull resources from multiple sources and direct them to where they were most needed, foreshadowed modern capital markets with their syndicated placements and networks of institutional investors. The rapid and accurate information that Rothschild carrier pigeons and messengers carried across Europe was the direct ancestor of the electronic communication systems that today allow traders anywhere in the world to instantly know market conditions everywhere else. But along with these innovations came the tensions that still characterized the relationship between finance and society. The ability to move capital across borders gave bankers power that often exceeded that of nominally sovereign governments. The loans the Rothschilds made to struggling states came with conditions that shaped national policies in ways that the affected populations rarely approved. The speed of financial information created advantages for those who possessed it at the expense of those who did not, widening inequalities that democratic systems were supposed to reduce. These tensions, present since Mayer Amschel's first business dealings, remained unresolved centuries later, manifesting themselves in contemporary debates about financial regulation, international taxation, and the appropriate role of private institutions in global economic governance. The Rothschilds' position as a Jewish family navigating predominantly Christian environments adds another layer of complexity to their story. On the one hand, their rise represented an unequivocal demonstration that talent and discipline could overcome barriers of discrimination, at least for some exceptional individuals in exceptional circumstances. The emancipation that Lionel achieved by taking his seat in the British Parliament paved the way for others who would follow, demonstrating that society could evolve in more inclusive directions. The family's philanthropic contributions to Jewish communities across Europe and later in Israel provided resources that helped preserve cultural and religious identity in the face of assimilationist pressures. On the other hand, the Rothschilds' visibility made them convenient targets for those seeking simple explanations for complex phenomena. The family's fortune, difficult to comprehend for outside observers who lacked access to the mechanisms by which it had been built, invited speculation that frequently took on an anti-Semitic hue. The geographical dispersion that was a source of commercial strength could be reinterpreted as evidence of an international conspiracy with no loyalty to any specific nation. The secrecy the family cultivated around its operations, a perfectly understandable commercial prudence in a sector where information was valuable, fueled theories about hidden manipulations that determined the fate of nations. These conspiracy theories predated the Rothschilds and would outlive them, but the family became their most frequent and visible vehicle. From the early pamphlets that circulated in the decades after Waterloo to the internet memes of the 21st century, the iconography of the manipulative Jewish banker repeatedly resorted to the name and image of the Rothschilds. It was an unfair association with the specific individuals who comprised the family, most of whom lived private lives without direct involvement in the business dealings that generated so much controversy. But it was also a reflection of historical realities that could not simply be denied. A distorted acknowledgement of the genuine power the family had wielded and the consequences that power had produced. The Rothschilds' relationship with the Zionist project, and later with the State of Israel, illustrated the complexities of their Jewish identity. Baron Edmond de Rothschild, of the French branch, became one of the main financiers of the first Jewish settlements in Ottoman Palestine in the late 19th century, long before political Zionism consolidated as an organized movement. His motivations combined genuine philanthropy with paternalistic views on how the settlers should live and work, creating tensions that eventually led to a rift between him and the pioneering movements he had initially supported. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, the document committing the British government to the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, was formally addressed to Lord Rothschild, recognizing the symbolic and practical role the family played in the British Jewish community. But this association with Zionism was not universal within the family, nor was it devoid of ambivalence. Some members feared that the Zionist project, by asserting a separate Jewish nationality, would compromise the integration that Jews like themselves had achieved in European societies. Others supported the creation of a refuge for persecuted Jews in Eastern Europe while not considering emigrating themselves. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the family maintained cordial relations with the new state, contributing to infrastructure and development projects, but few members chose to establish residence there. They were Europeans above all, their identities forged in London and Paris, Frankfurt and Vienna, not in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. The physical architecture the family left behind across Europe offered material testimony to their presence and values. The urban palaces they erected in Paris, London, and Vienna combined grandeur that proclaimed status with aesthetic sophistication that demonstrated cultivation. Country residences, such as Ferry Race in France or Mentmore in England, recreated on an even grander scale the splendor of the aristocratic palaces the family admired and sought to emulate. The art collections that filled these residences represented financial investments that preserved and often multiplied value, but also affirmations of cultural belonging that transcended commercial origins. The style that became known as Elegant Rothschild became synonymous with a particular form of opulence. A neo-Renaissance interiors with extravagant use of velvet and gilding, vast collections of armor and sculptures, a Victorian sense of horror vacui that filled every available surface with precious objects. It was a style that declared wealth without constraint, but also declared erudition and refinement, demonstrating that fortune accumulated through currency exchange and government loans could be converted into cultural capital that legitimized social standing in ways that money alone could not. The racehorses that Lionel and his descendants bred represented another way to access aristocratic circles from which Jews had traditionally been excluded. Horse racing was a sport of kings and nobles, its arena spaces where the social elite met and recognized each other. When Lionel's horse won the 1879 Derby, it was an achievement that transcended the prize money, demonstrating that a Jew could compete and triumph in a field that had been exclusively reserved for Christians. The fact that Lionel had to compete under a pseudonym, since the Jockey Club still did not admit Jews as members, underscored both the progress and the limits of acceptance that wealth could buy. The Bordeaux vineyards that the family acquired from the mid-19th century onwards occupied a particular position in this constellation of cultural investments. Wine was a product that combined commercial and aesthetic aspects, a consumer good that was also the object of refined appreciation. The great stoves of the MDOC carried prestige that transcended their value as agricultural properties. Their bottles served at tables where the destinies of nations were decided. When the Rothschilds acquired Stowe Laafite and Stowe Mouton, two of the most prestigious vineyards in the region, they entered a circle of owners that included some of the oldest and most established families of the French aristocracy. The management of these vineyards revealed distinct approaches among different branches of the family. At Lafayette, under the control of the branch descended from James, the tendency was towards continuity and conservatism, maintaining traditional practices that had established the wine's reputation over centuries. At Mouton, under the more iconoclastic leadership of Baron Philip de Rothschild in the 20th century, innovation was more valued. Philip introduced bottling at the chateau itself instead of barrel sales to merchants, commissioned renowned artists to create unique labels for each vintage, and campaigned for decades to raise the classification of his wine. When Mouton was finally promoted to first cru in 1973, it was both a victory for Philip personally and a demonstration that even seemingly fixed categories could be altered through persistence and persuasive ability. World War II represented a period of loss and hardship for the vineyards, as for so many other family assets. Mouton was occupied by German troops, its facilities used as military headquarters. Lafayette suffered a similar fate. Stocks of old wines were confiscated or destroyed, and the vintages produced during the occupation suffered from compromised quality due to a lack of materials and skilled labor. Post-war reconstruction required decades of work to restore vineyards and reputations damaged by the conflict. The trajectory of the Rothschild vineyards in the post-war period more broadly illustrated the challenges and opportunities the family faced during that time. On the one hand, reconstruction was necessary not only physically, but also commercially. Markets needed to be reclaimed, relationships with distributors re-established, and a new generation of consumers convinced of the value of wines. On the other hand, the post-war world offered opportunities that previous periods had not presented. Expanding American and Asian markets, an affluent middle class with aspirations for sophistication, and a global luxury culture in which prestigious brands found buyers willing to pay substantial premiums. The Rothschilds navigated these transformations with varying degrees of success. The vineyards thrived, their products becoming status symbols in emerging markets from China to Russia. The financial advisory business found a lucrative niche advising on the largest corporate transactions of the globalization era. Wealth management for high-net-worth families offered steady returns in a sector where discretion and continuity were values clients gladly paid for. But the overwhelming dominance the family had exerted over European finance in the 19th century was irrecoverable. Not due to management failures, but to structural transformations that had democratized and institutionalized functions previously the domain of exceptional families. The corporate structure governing Rothschild businesses in the early 21st century reflected these adaptations. The parent company, renamed Rothschild & COC, after the reunification of the London and Paris houses, was a holding company that controlled stakes in various operating subsidiaries. Although formally listed on the Paris Stock Exchange, the shareholding structure ensured that control remained firmly in family hands, with shares of different classes conferring differentiated voting rights that prevented any hostile takeover. It was a hybrid solution that combined access to public capital with the preservation of family governance, sacrificing some advantages of each model in favor of an intermediate position that seemed sustainable in the long term. The family gatherings that periodically brought together descendants of Mayer Amschel from all continents offered opportunities to renew ties that geographical dispersion tended to weaken. These events combined pomp and circumstance with practical concerns of governance and succession, opportunities for cousins who rarely met to renew mutual acquaintance, and for older generations to transmit to younger ones values and expectations they considered essential for the continuity of the family. But they were also occasions that revealed the tensions inherent in any family enterprise spanning multiple generations: disagreements over strategy, resentments over resource allocation, differences in vision about what the Rothschild name should represent in the contemporary world. The education of heirs represented a particularly significant investment for a family, whose continuity depended on each generation producing individuals capable of assuming the responsibilities that the previous one had carried. The best schools and universities in Europe and America trained young Rothschilds in finance, law, history, and the arts, preparing them for careers that might or might not involve direct participation in the family business. Internships at the family banks offered practical experience for those who demonstrated interest and aptitude. But the expectation that children would follow their parents into leadership positions, once practically automatic, was becoming increasingly voluntary in an era that valued individual achievement over family inheritance. The result was that not all Rothschilds in the 21st century worked in finance, and not all those who did held leadership positions in the family business. Some chose careers in law, medicine, academia, or the arts, distancing themselves from the commercial operations that had defined the family for generations. Others engaged in family philanthropy without participating in profit-making activities, dedicating themselves to causes they considered aligned with Rothschild values of social contribution. Still, others withdrew completely from public life, living off income from trusts and foundations that ensured a comfortable livelihood without requiring active engagement with the family business or image. This dispersion of engagement represented both risk and opportunity for family continuity. The risk was that, without generation renewal of committed leadership, the business would eventually pass into the hands of professional managers who did not share the emotional ties and long-term horizons that characterized family governance. The opportunity was that career diversification allowed the family as a whole to maintain a presence in multiple sectors of society, expanding networks of relationships and influence in ways that exclusive concentration on finance would not allow. The balance between these risks and opportunities was a subject of ongoing debate within family governance structures. Some argued for greater centralization, bringing dispersed resources together under unified management that would maximize scale and efficiency. Others defended the existing diversification, arguing that the family's resilience over centuries stemmed precisely from not being overly dependent on any specific activity or market. The partnership structures and family agreements governing the businesses were periodically reviewed to reflect provisional consensus between these divergent views, without any one view definitively prevailing over the other. What remained constant throughout these transformations was the awareness of belonging to something greater than any individual life. The Rothschilds of the 21st century knew themselves to be heirs to a history that had begun long before their birth and would continue long after their death. They carried a name that opened doors but also attracted scrutiny, that conferred advantages but imposed responsibilities. They were not merely individuals seeking personal fulfillment, but participants in a multi-generation enterprise whose success depended on the contributions each could make. It was a condition that some experienced as a privilege, others as a burden, and many as both simultaneously. The buildings that still bore the Rothschild name on their facades, the documents that still displayed the red shield in their headings, the wines that still carried the family name on their labels, all of this constituted a material reminder of a presence that extended across centuries and continents. But the true legacy resided less in physical structures than in practices and values passed down from generation to generation, in a way of doing business that prioritized long-term relationships over opportunistic transactions, in a commitment to excellence that manifested itself in financial operations as well as in wine production or art curation. It was an intangible legacy, but no less real for that, a cultural heritage that complemented and sometimes surpassed the material heritage in its influence on how Mayer Amschel's descendants lived their lives. The future remained, as always, uncertain. The technological transformations that had already fundamentally altered the financial sector continued to accelerate, with artificial intelligence and blockchain promising or threatening to revolutionize once again how capital was allocated and transactions were executed. The geopolitical tensions that had marked the early years of the 21st century seemed to intensify rather than diminish, raising questions about whether the international system that had underpinned financial globalization would survive the pressures it faced. Climate change, which threatened ecosystems, included the vineyards of Bordeaux among its potential victims, forcing adaptations in agricultural practices that had remained stable for centuries. Faced with these uncertainties, the Rothschilds did what they had done for generations. They adapted to circumstances while preserving what they considered essential to their identity. They invested in new technologies while maintaining a presence in traditional sectors. They cultivated relationships in emerging markets while nurturing established connections in mature markets. They prepared successors for responsibilities that did not yet exist while honoring commitments inherited from predecessors. It was a way of navigating history that had served them well for more than 2 centuries, and which offered at least some hope of serving them equally well in the decades and centuries to come. The lamp burned in the library as the last visitor examined portraits of ancestors whose names most of the public had already forgotten. Stern faces peered out from gilded frames, men and women who had lived extraordinary lives in extraordinary times, who had amassed fortunes and lost fortunes, who had built empires and watched empires crumble. They were faces that now belonged to history, but whose legacy continued to shape the present in ways not always visible to casual observers. The Rothschild story, like all true stories, was a never-ending story, its conclusion indefinitely postponed while new chapters continued to be written by descendants yet unborn. And so, as the shadows of dusk lengthened over St. Swithin's Lane and the last traders left their desks in the city of London, the name that had once designated only a house in a German ghetto remained inscribed in the structures of global capitalism. The Rothschilds had emerged from poverty and discrimination to build a presence that few before or since could match. They had demonstrated that geographical boundaries and social barriers could be transcended by those who combined intelligence with discipline, ambition with prudence, individualism with family cooperation. They had left their mark on continents, shaping railways and canals, financing wars and reconstructions, advising kings and presidents with the intimacy that only those who control indispensable resources can claim. But they had also demonstrated the limits of any human fortune. The circumstances that had allowed their rise had transformed in ways that even their perspicacity could not have fully anticipated. The founders' children rarely matched their parents' energy, and the grandchildren even less so that of their grandparents. The wars that had enriched one generation devastated the next. The political systems that had tolerated their power found ways to limit it. The fortune that seemed inexhaustible proved finite when confronted with demands that exceeded even its vast resources. The Rothschild story was, in this sense, a parable about the human condition in its relation to wealth and power. It demonstrated both what was achievable through extraordinary effort and what remained beyond the reach of even the most extraordinary effort. It revealed how success in one era could become an obstacle in another, how hard won advantages could evaporate when the conditions that sustained them disappeared. It taught, for those willing to learn, that all human constructions are transitory, subject to forces that transcend the will of their builders, destined to transform or disappear with the inexorable passage of time. But it also taught that, within those limits, remarkable achievements remained possible, that individuals could make a difference, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable circumstances, that families could transmit through generations not only material resources, but values and capabilities that allowed each generation to build upon the foundations laid by the previous one, that the world could be shaped by those with the vision to perceive opportunities where others saw only obstacles, and with the courage to act while others hesitated. These were lessons that transcended any specific family or fortune, universal truths that the particular story of the Rothschilds illustrated with singular clarity. In the Frankfurt cemetery where Mayer Amschel rested, the seasons followed one another as they had for more than 2 centuries since his death. Leaves fell in autumn, snow covered the tombstones in winter, flowers bloomed in spring, the sun warmed the stone in summer. The cycle continued, indifferent to fortunes accumulated and lost, to generations born and dying, to the transformations that reshaped cities and nations. It was a cycle that would remind any reflective visitor of the relativity of all human achievements, the fragility of all constructions we presume to be permanent. But it was also a cycle that testified to the persistence of memory, the human capacity to carry with them through time stories that illuminate the present and inform the future. The Rothschild story was one of those stories, a narrative that would continue to be told as long as there was interest in understanding how the modern world had formed, how global finance had developed, how a family of merchants in a medieval ghetto had transformed into the most influential bankers Europe had ever known. It was a story without a simple moral, without pure heroes or unequivocal villains, without a definitive conclusion that would allow the narrator to end with a satisfying period. It was simply a human story, with all the complexity and ambivalence that this designation implies. Mayer Amschel's descendants continue to live their lives in cities scattered across all continents, some still working in the institutions the family had founded, others pursuing entirely different paths. They carried with them the legacy of a name that was both a blessing and a burden, an opener of doors and an invitation to scrutiny. They individually decided what to do with this inheritance, how to balance family expectations with personal aspirations, how to contribute to a legacy they had received but not created. Their decisions would shape the next chapter of a story that already spanned more than 2 centuries and that, by all indications, would continue to unfold for centuries to come. Because that was, perhaps, the most profound lesson the Rothschild saga offered, that history never truly ends, that every conclusion is merely a prelude to new beginnings, that the legacy of any generation is raw material to be transformed by subsequent generations. The Rothschilds Mayer Amschel had known had disappeared, replaced by others he wouldn't have recognized. The Rothschilds of the present would eventually give way to others the current ones couldn't even imagine. And through all these transformations, something of what had begun in Frankfurt's Judengasse would continue. Transmuted but not obliterated. Different, but still connected to its origins by threads of memory and practice that persisted, even when their bearers weren't fully aware of what they carried. The red shield still gleamed in the afternoon sun, now on corporate structures instead of residential facades, on annual reports instead of seals, on websites instead of handwritten stationery. But it was the same shield that his Zarkel canon had adopted in the 16th century, the same symbol that Mayer Amschel had transformed into the brand of one of the largest financial operations in history. It was a reminder that, in a world of perpetual change, some things managed to endure. Some identities managed to maintain themselves through transformations that would have destroyed less entrenched presences. It was, in its modest way, a small triumph over time, an affirmation of continuity amidst the endless flow of births and deaths, fortunes made and unmade, empires erected and crumbled. And when the last light of day finally faded over the rooftops of London, Paris, Frankfurt, and the other cities where the Rothschild story had unfolded, the world continued to spin in its indifferent orbit, carrying with it all human stories, all fortunes and misfortunes, all hopes and disappointments that constituted the collective experience of our species. The Rothschilds were part of this larger story, a thread in a tapestry of inexhaustible complexity, significant to those who followed it, but insignificant when viewed from the cosmic perspective that relativizes all human achievements. It was a humbling, but also liberating, perspective, reminding all who pursue fortune and power that their accomplishments, however impressive they may seem at the moment, will eventually be absorbed by the flow of time, transformed into material for stories that others will tell, examples for lessons that others will draw, chapters in narratives that have not yet been written, but that will surely come.